The Cascade Mountains stood majestic. Towering pines scratched the sky. Crystal-clear rivers cut through valleys. Sarah and Jake were ready for adventure. Their backpacks were heavy with supplies. Excitement filled their hearts as they set off on the trail. The air was crisp. The sun shone through the trees. This was their escape from the city. They chatted excitedly as they hiked. Stories of past adventures tumbled out. Jake told a funny story about a disastrous camping trip. They laughed, their voices echoing through the stillness. Each step took them deeper into the wilderness. The trail wound ahead, promising breathtaking views and the unknown. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers. The forest was alive with sounds. The wind whispered through the trees. An owl hooted in the distance. Sarah lay awake. A strange unease crept over her. She listened intently to the night. A twig snapped. Her heart pounded in her chest. She turned to Jake, sound asleep. She didn't want to wake him. It was probably just a small animal. She tried to ignore the feeling of dread that was growing in her stomach. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Another snap, closer this time. She sat up, her eyes wide. Something was out there. She gently shook Jake awake. "Jake," she whispered, "did you hear that?" He mumbled something in his sleep and turned over. "Jake, wake up!" she hissed, her voice shaking. He opened his eyes, confused. "What is it?" he mumbled. "I heard something," she whispered. "Something's out there." The next morning, the forest was bathed in sunlight, casting a serene glow over the landscape. The events of the night seemed like a bad dream, a distant memory that was quickly fading with the morning light. They packed up their campsite, moving with a sense of urgency, yet trying to maintain their usual routine. They continued on their hike, their earlier unease fading with each step, the beauty of the forest distracting them from their worries. They reached a clearing and saw a group of hikers. The hikers looked worried, their faces etched with concern. They were talking in hushed tones, their voices barely audible over the rustling leaves. Sarah and Jake approached them cautiously, sensing the tension in the air. "Excuse me," Sarah asked, her voice tinged with curiosity and concern. "Is everything all right?" One of the hikers, an older woman with a weathered face, turned to them, her eyes reflecting years of experience. "There's been a bear sighted in the area," she said, her voice grave and filled with warning. "A big one. It's been aggressive," she added, her words hanging heavily in the air. Jake chuckled nervously, trying to mask his unease. "A bear? Here?" he asked, his voice betraying his anxiety. The woman nodded seriously. "Stay alert," she warned, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "Don't leave any food out," she continued, emphasizing the importance of their safety. "And whatever you do, don't get between a mother and her cubs," she added, her voice filled with urgency. They thanked the hikers and continued on their way, their minds racing with the new information. The encounter left them shaken, their earlier confidence now replaced with a sense of vulnerability. They tried to brush it off, reminding themselves that they were experienced hikers. They knew how to stay safe in bear country, or so they thought. But a seed of doubt had been planted, growing with each step they took deeper into the forest. The trail grew steeper with every step they took. The air grew colder, sending chills through their bones. The forest became denser, the trees closing in around them, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the thick canopy above. They were deep in bear country now, a place where few dared to venture. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves sent shivers down their spines. The forest was alive with unseen eyes. They stopped for a break by a small stream, the sound of water offering a brief respite. Jake pulled out their map, his hands trembling slightly. "We're not too far from the peak," he said, pointing to a spot on the map. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his anxiety. "We should reach it by tomorrow afternoon," he added. Sarah nodded, trying to appear calm, but her heart was racing. The weight of the forest seemed to press down on them. As they were packing up, Jake noticed something unusual on the ground. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and urgent, "look at this." He pointed to the ground where, imprinted in the soft earth, was a massive paw print. It was fresh, the edges still sharp. It was much too big to belong to anything but a bear. Fear coiled in Sarah's stomach like a tightening knot. The realization hit them hard. The hikers' warnings echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the danger they were in. They were being watched, every move scrutinized by unseen eyes. They needed to get out of there, and fast. They quickly packed up their gear, their movements hurried and frantic. With every second that passed, the sense of urgency grew. They hurried down the trail, the forest closing in around them, the shadows growing longer. They hiked in tense silence. The forest seemed to press in on them, the dense foliage creating an almost claustrophobic atmosphere. Every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs heightened their anxiety. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows that danced eerily among the trees. They needed to find a place to camp before darkness enveloped them completely. They rounded a bend in the trail, their hearts pounding with the exertion and the unknown. Suddenly, they froze in their tracks. There, in the middle of the path, stood a massive black bear, its presence both majestic and terrifying. Its fur was thick and matted, a testament to its rugged life in the wild. Its claws were long and sharp, glinting menacingly in the fading light. It was bigger than either of them had imagined. A true giant of the forest. The bear let out a deep growl that seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet, reverberating through the trees. Sarah and Jake stared at it, their blood turning to ice. The primal fear of facing a wild predator gripped them. They were frozen in terror, unable to move, unable to breathe, their minds racing for a solution. The bear took a step towards them, its eyes locked onto theirs, assessing the threat. Its hot, fetid breath filled the air, a pungent reminder of its raw power and proximity. Sarah knew they had to do something. The paralysis of fear had to be broken. She grabbed a rock and hurled it at the bear, screaming at the top of her lungs, hoping to scare it away. The rock bounced harmlessly off the bear's thick hide, barely making an impact, but the noise seemed to startle it, a momentary distraction from its advance. The bear dropped to all fours and charged, a blur of motion and raw power, closing the distance between them in an instant. Adrenaline surged through Sarah and Jake. They turned and ran, their backpacks bouncing against their backs. The bear was right behind them, its heavy paws pounding the earth. They could hear its enraged growls echoing through the trees. They dodged trees and scrambled over rocks. Their lungs burned, their legs screamed for rest, but they couldn't stop. Not now, not when their lives depended on it. They stumbled into a clearing. There, in the fading light, they saw it, a small, dilapidated cabin. It was their only hope. They sprinted towards it, their hearts pounding in their chests. Jake reached the cabin first. He fumbled with the doorknob. It was locked. He slammed his shoulder against the door. The wood splintered, but the door held. The bear was closing in. They could hear its heavy breathing. Jake slammed his shoulder against the door again. This time it burst open. They tumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind them. They leaned against the rough-hewn logs, gasping for air. They could hear the bear outside, its frustrated roars echoing through the small cabin. They were safe for now, but they knew they couldn't stay there forever. The cabin was dark and dusty. Cobwebs hung from every corner. It was clear that no one had been there for years, but it was shelter. And right now, that was all that mattered. Sarah rummaged through their backpacks. They had to come up with a plan. They couldn't stay trapped in the cabin forever. The bear would wait them out. She found their map and spread it out on the dusty floor. There had to be another way out of there, a way to escape the bear. Her finger traced the lines on the map. And then she saw it. A river. It wasn't far. If they could reach the river, they might be able to outrun the bear. They pushed a heavy dresser against the door, hoping to buy themselves some precious time. They knew it wouldn't hold the bear forever, but it was their only option. They gathered what little food and water they had left, knowing it wouldn't be enough. They had to move fast. Every second counted. They crept through the woods, their hearts pounding with every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs. The sound of the river grew louder, a constant reminder of the danger ahead. They could see the moonlight glinting off the rushing water, illuminating their path. The river was a churning torrent of white water, fierce and unrelenting. Logs and debris raced downstream, carried by the powerful currents. It was a dangerous crossing, even without a bear on their trail. They had no choice but to face it. They had to risk it. Their survival depended on it. They waded into the icy water, the current tugging at their legs. They held on to each other for support, their backpacks weighing them down. The water was freezing cold, numbing their fingers and toes. They struggled against the current. The roar of the water filled their ears. They couldn't hear if the bear was still following them. They didn't dare look back. The river swept them downstream, tossing them around like rag dolls. They were battered against rocks. They were submerged in the icy water. But they held on, their will to survive stronger than ever. They were swept around a bend in the river. The trees thinned. The current began to slow. They saw the bank ahead. With the last of their strength, they dragged themselves onto dry land. They collapsed on the riverbank, gasping for air. They were soaked to the bone, bruised and battered. But they were alive. They had escaped the bear. They lay there for a long time, the adrenaline slowly draining from their bodies. The forest around them was silent, except for the sound of their own ragged breathing. They had faced their fears. They had survived. They slowly sat up and looked around. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the river. They were a long way from the trail, but they were alive, and they had each other. They spent the next few hours drying their clothes and warming themselves in the sun. They ate the last of their food. They knew they had a long journey ahead of them, but they were no longer afraid. They set off through the forest, their steps lighter now. They had faced their fears and emerged stronger. They had learned the true meaning of survival, and they had gained a deeper appreciation for the power and the beauty of the wilderness.